Hi everyone, it's Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting. I am here to walk you through the process of creating one of our Embracing Our Scraps quilt blocks. I'd love to have you join me. Let's get started. So to begin with, if you haven't downloaded the Scrapbusting tutorial, you can get it at joyfulandmaryquilting.com/scraps. It gives you all the details on how to trim your scrap stash down to the point that it's usable. I felt like I've got all these beautiful scraps, and if I cut them and put them into boxes and bins and everything else, what good are they unless I'm putting them into a quilt? So that's what I decided to do. I decided to come up with a pattern, this block, and create the Embracing Our Scraps quilt. So I have been doing this in a 21-day challenge, and there is a handout for this as well. It's at joyfulandmaryquilting.com/owl. This won't be available forever. This is just available right now. If you're interested in downloading that, go to our website and download this pattern. I've had some comments on our YouTube videos because each day I've been reporting in on how I'm doing in getting this quilt finished. And the comments have been, can you show me how to make the block? It's a foundation pieced block, although I do provide templates for the block if you're interested in that. But I'm going to walk you through the process of creating the foundation pieced block. Now, I had all of my pieces cut. If you look at previous videos, you're going to see my little bins were full to the brim, and they are getting empty because I'm finishing up. But I do have enough to show you how to make one of these blocks. You'll need the foundation pattern, which is in the Embracing Our Scraps handout, as well as a few supplies. Now in the handout, it tells you exactly what you need for rectangles and squares and pieces and all. I had those cut and put in my bins, and each time I make a block, I will take out all the pieces in order for one block and I clip them together. So that's the first thing I do. I make sure that all of my pieces have been sprayed with a pressing solution before I cut them, just because it makes them easier to handle, especially in this pattern with all the bias edges. So that's important as well. In addition, you're going to need a glue stick. We use a glue stick a lot with this particular pattern. If you have a perforating blade, I highly recommend it. It makes it so much easier to remove the paper. So this one is by Olfa. It's available. The link is in the description. You'll need your rotary cutter. You'll need a ruler of some sort just to cut your triangles. And then I like the add a quarter ruler when I'm actually creating my seam allowance. You'll need some pins, especially a flathead pin, maybe one or two, just while we're putting the blocks together. And then you'll need a 6.5-inch ruler. You can use a larger one if that's all you have, but the 6.5 inch is the size of the block. It just makes it really easy to trim. I'm also going to be using my rotating mat. I like the fact that it moves so that when I'm cutting my block, I can just turn the mat and I don't have to move my ruler and move my block each time I want to make a cut. That's totally optional as well. So I'm going to show you how I do this. We'll put piece by piece into the block. I'll sew it. I'll press it. I'll kind of give you my system of how I foundation piece along the way. You may have a different way of doing it, but I think this works pretty efficiently and I hope that you enjoy it. So let's start with piece A1. The first thing we need to do before we do anything, and I feel like this is a really important step, is I use my Olfa perforating blade and my ruler, and I am going to actually mark all of the seam lines. One swipe, it's going to perforate, and you're going to see later why this makes a huge difference. So you're going to go on every single line and you're going to make that perforation. The rest of these, as well as these, which I have already done, and this one is all perforated. You can't see it on the camera, but you can feel it on the back. There's all these perforations in here, and this makes a huge difference when it comes to removing the paper and folding it back to cutting our seam allowance. So I really, really recommend getting one of those. They're not very expensive. They're available on Amazon. The link is in the description, but I cannot live without mine when I foundation piece. There are 14 pieces on the foundation pattern. However, A14 and A10 are 2 squares, and A1 and A6 are 2 squares. We're going to cut those squares on the diagonal and set aside one side of those for another block. So I'll show you what I mean by that. We're done with our blade. We are going to take all of our pieces. I have them in order. I like to have them in order. It just helps me to keep track of everything. So we are going to cut this on the diagonal. And this one, this is piece A6. Also going to cut that on the diagonal. Now we're going to set these two pieces aside for another block. We're going to have A1 and A6 right here. We're going to do the same thing when we get down to the smaller triangles. We are also going to cut those on the diagonal as well, but we're not there yet. We are going to position piece A1 where it goes. Now this is the first piece, and this is the one, if you have a light board, you can put it on the light board or you can hold it up to a light. You can pretty much see right here that I've got that 1/4 inch. I'll check it after I glue it down, but I'm going to take my glue stick and I'm just going to tip this up a bit. I'm going to put a dab of glue there just to hold it down. Now I'll take my foundation paper and I'm going to fold it back right on that crease. I'm going to use my add a 1/4 ruler and I'm going to trim any excess off, which it looks like I did pretty good. I don't have any excess. So I am ready to add piece A2, which is next in line. I'm going to place A2 right sides together with A1. I can see my perforation, so I know that I have my piece centered, hanging over a little bit over each seam. Actually, it's a little bit longer. And then I'm going to put a pin in it. I like these flathead pins just to hold it in place. When you turn it over and put it under your sewing machine, you want to make sure that this doesn't happen and you sew this flap down. You want to make sure that everything is nice and even. So I try and keep my hand under it. Then I'll place it under my sewing machine. I'm going to start at the edge and I'm going to sew all the way down that line, the A1, A2 line. So let's do that. You want to make sure that your sewing machine stitch length is, I don't know, about a 1.8 or so. Usually when you turn it on, it's a 2.2. We do that just because we want to make sure that we actually have that piece anchored down, and it also helps with perforating the paper. Now, this is a key point that I do with my iron, and I don't know if you do this when you foundation piece, but the first thing, of course, we always want to set that seam, which I've done. That just makes the threads a part of the fabric. Then I'm going to use my glue stick, and I'm going to use it every single time when I've added a new piece before I press. This is what's going to keep this nice and flat and ready for our next piece. So I like the purple stick because I can see where I've gone with it. I'm going to put a strip of glue right across there. I'm going to push that and I'm going to press it. That will dry the glue, and look at how flat that is. I mean, this is just so perfect. One of the issues that we can have with foundation piecing is the pieces can pull back as we're adding the next piece, and we're still sewing on the line, which means we have extra bulk in the piece, which we don't want to have. So this is so flat because of that glue. Now I'm going to turn it over, and now we know we've got a perforation here, so I don't need to use a ruler. I don't need to use anything. I just fold it back. I am going to cut my 1/4 inch seam. So there I am ready now to add piece A3, which is right here. Right sides together. I'm going to line them up, but be careful and make sure you check every time that you've got enough on each edge, at least a 1/4 inch of course, on each edge, because you can kind of start veering off in one direction if you're not careful, since we're trying to do a straight line here. So I'm going to put my pin back here. You don't want to get it in the way of the seam because that can damage your needle on your sewing machines, but just enough to anchor the piece in place. Now we're going to go back. We're going to sew on the A2, A3 line. So I've sewn on the A2, A3 line, take my pin out, set my seam, and then I'm going to run that glue stick once again right there, and I'm going to make sure that that seam is pressed so there's not a tuck or a fold. And there again, look at how flat that is. It's just such a perfect way to keep that anchored. Now we're going to fold back. We're perforated, so we don't have to worry about doing anything with a ruler other than placing our add a 1/4 ruler. And you don't have to use an add a 1/4 here either. You can just use your regular 1/4 inch and line it up. Again, it's up to you. The add a 1/4 is just easy for me to use. I'm going to do A4, place them right sides together, put my pin way back, take my pin out, and it's the same process, setting that seam and then using our glue stick. I try and place that line of glue pretty close to the seam That's where we usually have the issue, is right there. So that's where I want to make sure it's anchored, but you know, whatever you do is fine. We're going to fold it on the A4, A5 line and place our add a quarter. You would put the 1/4 inch line of your ruler right on that fold if you were just using a regular ruler. Now we're going to add the last rectangle in this row, and that's going to be followed by our triangle A6. So I've placed that. I'm going to go ahead and sew again. So we have that sewn. Remove our pin, anchor our seam, put our glue stick glue on there, and press. And then we have one last piece that we need to trim on this direction. Then we're going to flip it and we're going to go the other direction. Now we're going to place our triangle. One thing you want to do is you just want to make sure that your triangle points are lined up. These are oversized, so it's really not going to make a big difference. But if you try and see if it's lined up and your ruler is pretty well square on here, it looks good. We just want to make sure that we're not off too far one side or the other, and this looks pretty well centered. Put our pin in, sew. So now we have that last triangle done. We're going to place that glue stick. I like to cap the glue stick after every time because it does tend to dry out a little bit. So you want to make sure that you've put the cap back on, at least over the top of it, so that you don't have an issue each time you use it. So now we have this much done, which looks really good. We're going to turn this over and we're going to go A7. Now this is where these stitches are sticking out. We need to release those stitches in order to fold the paper back. So just release them, and then the paper will fold back nicely. Now one of the things that's kind of a pain when you're sewing is when you sew over these little corners, because then you have to pick out those little pieces. So if you think about it, you can just tear those off right now. It's not going to make any difference in the long run, and it just gives you one less little teeny piece to pick off. I'm going to place my ruler here and trim that seam nicely. Got a little bit of a layer there, so I'm in an awkward position. So there we have that nicely trimmed seam, and we're going to take this piece and center it on the seam as well. So I've got it centered. This one you especially need to pin because it can really get crooked easily when you're placing this underneath the machine. So I like to do on those long seams, I like to pin twice. Make sure again that it's away from the seam, but just enough to hold it down. Then when I put it under the machine, I can sew and I don't have to worry about that folding back where I can't see it, because we're kind of sewing blindly here. So let's go ahead and sew on that A7 line. So I'll remove my pins, set my seam. I'm going to give it a good bit of glue on there and press that down. So now you can see this is working nicely. Now this piece is a little bit oversized, but it's because in my scraps I don't cut less than a 1.5 inch wide. So this is the smallest width that I had of a strip. That's what I'm going to use. I don't want to keep any of these little teeny tiny pieces, so I'm just going to trim that off, and we do have about a 1/4 inch that's wasted on this. Now we have some strips that we're going to add, and just make sure each time that you have an equal amount hanging over the edge. Now this one, I'm going to put a pin in here. I'm going to put a pin in here, but the better you get at it, the less pinning you're going to need to do. You'll just remember to hold your hand under it when you place it under so that that doesn't get caught. But to start with, I like to make sure that it's all pinned. So let's go ahead and sew on that A7, A8 line. So that's done. I'm going to remove my pins, take my glue stick, press that over with my fingers, and there I've got that nice edge once again. I've got 2 more pieces, and then we'll work on the other side. Now you can see I'm going slowly so you can see it, but you can really get going pretty fast on these, and you can complete this block in not a whole lot of time. I'm only going to use 1 pin here because I can feel it there. I'm going to put it underneath my machine. That one is finished. Set my seam. glue stick. And now this glue stick, there's no residue with it. It's not going to cause a problem with your fabric. It comes out, it's washable, so you don't need to worry about it doing any damage. We've got that last little corner, our A10, which is also A14. The same size triangle is used, but two different pieces. If you don't want to use two different pieces, you can use the same one, it's fine. I wanted mine to be really scrappy, which is why I have two different pieces that I'm going to cut on the diagonal, and then I'm going to set two of them aside. So just like I did before, I'm going to put my ruler corner to corner, save two for another time, and then I'll use this one here. I'm going to put this one at the back because that's going to be my final piece. Now, got one more to add here. I'm not going to pin it. Make sure that it looks like it's aligned pretty well. Again, oversized, so it's not a big worry. So I've sewn on that line. My last corner on this quadrant, push it toward the edge. So everything is done from here. Now we're going to work on this edge. You're going to do it exactly the same way as you did before. We're going to release those stitches right there. We're going to pick out that little piece right here just to make it a little bit easier when we have to remove our paper. Now I'm going to trim that off. And once again, you'll follow the exact same instructions that we just did. Placing each one of our pieces centered. And again, I'm going to pin these two. So go ahead and put those additional 4 pieces on, and then I'll show you how to trim them up. And there we are with our semi-finished block. You can see all the pieces are there, but it is definitely in need of a trim. So this is where we need to use our 6.5 inch ruler, and we are going to trim all the way around the edge. I like to use my rotating mat. I have a little one that works really well for smaller blocks, and it just turns so nicely, but it anchors my block in place when I put pressure on it from my ruler. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stand up because it's easier for me to stand up when I do this. I want to make sure that everything is lined up. You can see my diagonal seam right there. I want it to cut right through those 2 corners. I know that if it does that, the other corners are going to be lined up. I want to make sure everything is in good shape. Then I'm going to put pressure on it with my left hand as I cut with my right. Sorry to block the camera for a second. And then I turn it. Keep your fingers out of the way. That's why my fingers curled, because we don't want to get them in the way. Now I know my head's in the way as I cut this, but I think you've got a good idea of what we're doing. And there I have my trimmed block. Now you can see it's so flat. I removed my paper off of my block before I sew them together. Some people don't. Again, personal preference. I just don't like picking off all those little pieces that are around the edge. So I just take it off, and I hope that everything is in good shape. So you can see how easy with that perforating blade, how quickly everything comes off. And then of course your sewing helps as well. For the most part, it's a lot faster than what we would have to do otherwise. Then we're going to do now, I wouldn't tug on those because of those bias edges, but we're pretty stable here. So I do tug on those just to release those stitches from the paper, and then you can go along and just clean up those seams as well. They'll dissolve in the wash anyway. It doesn't really make that much difference that you remove them. But look at that perfect and beautiful block. It's nice and square. It's our 6.5 inches. And then if you need to, give it another press, but looks pretty flat to me. And there it is, our finished block. I know foundation piecing can be scary. If you have done it before and you had a bad experience, I hope you'll give it a try again with my way of doing it. It's really easy. Look at this beautiful block that you come up with, and you are using your scraps, which is the best way to use them, to put them into a quilt and get your money's worth for that fabric that you purchased. I am always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you create this quilt and join with me in our 21-day challenge.